Here's my version of Universal Design for Learning and my project with student public speaking. At the core of UDL is this concept of multiple means. That's the gist of it. That's the essence of UDL. Multiple means of what? Well, one thing is instruction. The way the teacher presents the material should be presented through multiple means. That's also called representation. So I'm giving you alternative terms for it, which itself is multiple means. UDL was developed by this organization called CAST. I use their terminology and also mine. What I'm presenting here is basically my own breakdown, but I also corresponded to theirs. Another element of UDL is engagement. This is how the students engage with the material. And this is subsequent to the stage of instruction. Okay, this is where you get the discussions on active learning. Also, UDL is about multiple means of demonstration or expression. That's how the students present and express their learning. Okay, the idea is to give them multiple means, the chance to present their learning through multiple means. And finally, we have assessment or feedback, which are two sides of the same coin, or evaluation. This is where you test the students' learning, and thereby you also give them feedback. All right, so the idea is to give them feedback through audio format, video format, text, multiple means that's accessible. And if you want, you can complete the cycle, because from the assessment that you receive, you can update your instruction. All right, so that's kind of like the cycle of UDL, the four main elements that I can point out to. In the instruction and assessment stages, it's primarily the teacher who is in charge. In the engagement and demonstration, you have the students who are in charge. When we say universal, what we effectively mean is inclusive. Inclusive learning. So inclusive in the context of learning. Now this itself can be broken down into some elements. So one is what I would call physical capacities. Another one is cognitive capacities. These two are things that are more or less understood. There's quite a bit of acknowledgement around it, and the Accessibility Center, the Disability Centers usually take care of these elements quite well. Although we have to come back to that also. Another element is personal capacities. I like this picture of the fingers because not only it shows the antisocial behavior and emotions, but also the idea that we are as unique as our fingertips. And then finally, there is an element of external capacities. So things about their home, their background, and so forth. Okay, now a few comments on this slide. This is another way of looking at UDL and breaking it down. When you look at this, you might think of other categories or other examples, and that's perfectly fine. This is just my version of doing it, so I'm just giving you a sample. I would encourage all of you, as you develop your own UDL design, to come up with your own version, come up with your own breakdown. Also, I'm using the word capacities instead of disabilities, so you can figure out why that is. The idea is that the terminology that we use for something does make a difference. So the way we think of a concept does affect the way we treat it. So let's be conscious of that. Temporary conditions refer to things like surgery, trauma, or accident. Executive functions include a lot of things like time management, coordination, and so forth. One thing that I do want to emphasize here is this idea of personalities. There is some lack of acknowledgement around this. So what I would suggest all of you to do is to check this TED Talk. This is my favorite TED Talk by Susain, Cain, The Power of Introverts. I was personally a victim of this lack of acknowledgement. The idea of recognizing introversion and giving the students the chance to work on their own and not always pushing them or forcing them to work in a team. That's also an element of UDL. I'm going to post the URL link for this in the comment section. The relevant question here is, when there's the Student Accessibility Center, why should we care about UDL? Now, this is kind of important, and we have to make a fine distinction here between prefitting and retrofitting. UDL is about prefitting. Retrofitting is inherently non-UDL. The idea of UDL is not to rely on the accommodations or the adapting provided by the Student Accessibility Center to minimize that need. The design should be such that it already accommodates the needs of the students, so that there should be almost no need or minimum need for those accommodations. for those external things. If you want to understand what is prefitting, a good way of thinking about it is the adjustable state. Adjustable state is by nature UDL. Okay, and I got that idea from another TED Talk by Todd called The Myth of Average. So this is another homework for you. It kind of talks about this concept of prefitting, and I'm going to put the link for that as well. Now the question here is, does UDL mean one size fits all? And the answer to that is no. UDL is about adjustable size to fit all, or one design to fit all. So we're not talking about a rigid size or a rigid design. We're talking about a design that inherently or by nature is accommodating to multiple forms and multiple means. Let me show you a funny clip here.
Hold it right there. Surrender or prepare to be sunk.
No way! We'll defy you to the death!
Stroke. I'm rowing as fast as I can, sir.
No, I'm having one.
Remember what I told you about running away from your troubles?
Yeah?
Let's do it!
All right, now why am I showing you this? There are a few reasons. One is, if you can come up with a comical video, that would help engage students more holistically. Okay, another concept here is when he talks about running away from your troubles, that's retrofit. Prefit would be not to commit the crime to begin with, not to get into trouble with the law authorities. Another UDL element in this short video is, when you have a ship, you also have a lifeboat. So having a lifeboat along with the ship is multiple means of transportation in this case, or multiple means of saving yourself from drowning. Another element here is the clip shows the Indian guy rowing as a laborer. So that's something to be careful about. You know, we have diverse set of students. Now, if something is like comical by nature, maybe that can be understood, but still take that into consideration. You know, maybe it needs some form of debriefing. You don't want to turn the students off because of that. There is a juicy poem by Hafiz which reminds me of UDL. Whoever wishes to come, tell them to come. Whatever they want to say, tell them to say. We do not look down on anyone as scum. We've no guard or barrier to block their way. I have a lot more to say on Hafiz, but that would be a digression. My specific UDL project was about student oral presentations in integrative seminar, which is a research paper course. In some courses, it makes sense to have the students come to your office to do the oral or to record themselves at home. But in academic research, they would have to present it to an audience, and maybe not a large audience, but still they need to have public speaking skills. So I wanted my students to develop those skills without having the trauma. So the first thing was change the name to panel discussion. Oral presentation carries a lot of past negative experience, so let's just not use that word. And for a simple name change, it's actually pretty effective. Now, the two things that I focused on were confidence and competence, and there's clearly a correlation between the two. And this is one of the messages I want to get to my students, that practice makes perfect. If you're not confident, it's probably because you're not competent. And as you develop your competence, you're also becoming more confident, right? So one element was not to stand in front of the whole class, which can be terrible for them. Instead, let's have small groups. So those are the panels. Another thing is each person presents only 5 minutes, so just the gist of it. And they also bring an artwork, so that's also multiple means. I'm going to talk about that a bit more. It also distracts from the whole, the formality of it a little bit, just to, make things more juicy. And also ask advice. So each student brings a problem or question that they have encountered in their research and ask the advice of their classmates on that. So it kind of makes it a little bit more interactive and more engaging with the whole panel. So you are part of them, they're part of your research, and it makes it more friendly. For competence, I divided that into 2 sessions so they get more practice. I gave them the evaluation forms beforehand so that they know how they're going to be evaluated and they can prepare. And there was a Moodle quiz to prepare beforehand. Okay, so I gave them some questions on that. So that's a funny cartoon. So here's how the class looks like. You have groups of about 5 students and they take turns to present. The other students take notes on the presentation, and then there is a Q&A session. So I had my hidden camera there without their consent. Now let's see if you can blow the whistle on me. Here's a snapshot of how my course looks like on Moodle. So first notice the course title itself, there is some UDL in that, so go figure. And then for each panel discussion, there are 2 things. One of them is a quiz, and one of them is the instructions and the submission. So the idea of UDL is that it's not the teacher who has to chew the food for the students, but it's about helping the students to chew the food for themselves, right? So the quizzes, there's usually at the beginning some sort of simple tips and instructions, and then there are questions on that. So the sample of questions would be something like this, usually a true or false or multiple choice question, and they receive immediate feedback. So they get the right answer and they get a little tip at the bottom. Another example of a question would be something like this, where they receive feedback in front of each option that they choose. There is specific feedback, but there is also a general feedback at the bottom. And these are things that I typed in, so some tips for the students. And then something that's really important here is try another question like this one. So Moodle has that capacity, and UDL is about, trying to capitalize on the Moodle capacities to make the course as UDL as possible. Now this took a lot of my time because I have to create multiple versions of each question, and Moodle would pull out one of them randomly, and if they missed, or even if they got it right, they could retry. And there was no penalty for missing an answer. So as long as they wanted to try, they could try. So the idea of UDL is that if you want them to have multiple means of representation and presentation, then let them try as much as they want without penalty. I was also inspired by Dale Carnegie's classical work on art of public speaking, so I put some of that in there. And there was this question where I let them practice some of their Quebecois French. The evaluation forms which they were given beforehand looked something like this, with a number of criteria by which they evaluated themselves. So it was peer evaluated. And this was not so much about judging each other, but it was more about preparing beforehand. So these are very simple and logical things to take into account when preparing for the presentation, and they were given this beforehand, right? Now you might be wondering, like, what is this artwork? So I'm going to turn to that right away. Having students do artwork in academic research is actually very UDL because it's really engaging to have multiple means of presenting something abstract in the form of art. Now here are some examples of what they did. This is about the Greek myth and its influence on the movie industry and businesses today. So that was quite thoughtful. You get to see a wide range of artistic skills. Some of them are very good, like driverless cars, and some of them are good. And all of them are very thoughtful. They all show engagement with the research. And like, there's no way you can tell what this was all about. So this is why I make the students write a short description behind their work just to explain what it is. And even then, I also interview the students after they do the panel discussion. They come see me, and I spend a few minutes just to debrief and let them relax, and also tell me more about their research, how they're doing, any problems they're facing in their literature review, and so forth. So this one actually turns out to be quite thoughtful. The blue dots here are the drones of Amazon. The green is the environmental benefit that they have, and the red is the unemployment that they cause. And the thesis of the student is that overall the benefit outweighs the cost. Now, something that I want to point out is that this student actually, now this is abstract art, and it may not be your taste, but it's actually interesting that this student is actually going into the law school. And one thing that I've noticed with artworks is that usually students who are very strong academically or mathematically, they don't produce the best art. The best art comes from students who are not strong in the other elements. And so here is where you see how diverse their talents are. So if a student is a mess in a certain area, you're going to see that they have a lot of talents in some other area, and that's really beautiful to see. Here's some data on my course design. the effectiveness of the evaluation table, which I showed you, and also the Moodle quizzes, which we looked at briefly, and also the Moodle instructions page. Now, a couple of things. One main shortcoming of this study is the sample size. It was only 25 students. And also these are self-reported scores. But I also want to point out something that's quite important. You don't score UDL points by having a large green segment. On the contrary, what shows UDL is when you see diverse learning capacities engaged in your course. If you think in terms of UDL, it only makes sense that you would get a bunch of students who don't find an activity helpful, but find another activity helpful. What you want to see is that for each student, for each unique human being, you have at least one option which works and helps them learn. So it's really about diversity, not uniformity. I also gave my students the option to show me in a creative way a comparison between previous class orals and the current group panel model. So this is what one of them gave, past presentation 2015. As opposed to the panel presentation this year. So kind of presenting how prepared they were and how effective it was. Another student drew this one about their stress level. This, by the way, is kind of like using or abusing my students and get them to provide content for my UDL project. For the two criteria of confidence and competence, I had these students rate themselves out of 10 on how confident they were before this course and after the course, and also how competent they were in public speaking. Now, again, the difference probably is not too significant given the small sample size. I do have to point out something, that self-reported levels of satisfaction or evaluation are not as subjective as we tend to think about them. There are some studies showing that actually our self-reported levels tend to be quite objective and quite reliable based on other elements that they use to gauge that. But still, it's good to have more than one way of measuring. From UDL to UDL, so let me explain what this is. My experience with UDL gradually transformed my entire outlook on life. So with universal design for learning, the idea is that a single competency can be packaged and delivered in multiple ways. Kind of like you have a candy and it can be wrapped in different colors. It's still the same candy. Not to define knowledge by only one form of its expression. So you can have multiple lights, multiple colors, but all of them show you the electricity, and all of them are forms of light. So to accept that. Now, this is not just about learning. It's not just about knowledge, which can be presented in multiple forms, but everything is like that. So UDL expanded my own capacity to absorb and accommodate multiple colors without getting caught up in any of them. So that's where I got the second UDL, which is unitive diversification of life, I would say. So that's the idea of recognizing the infinitely diverse colors in which the life principle manifests itself, to embrace everything indiscriminately with compassion. So the common ground here is to drop our sensitivity about particular modes and realizing how they are all reflections of the same encompassing reality. Our education system is part of the mass production machine of the society. Now, the sad thing is that we must conform in order to survive. And our children are pretty smart to pick that up. We receive them after 12 years of conformity. It's probably impossible to be free from all conformity, but at least it's better to be a little authentic than not at all. All right. So I have this UDL mantra, which I share with you, and this is something that I found quite useful for myself. I don't want you assimilated. Diversity is appreciated. Using a poem or a mantra, by the way, is itself an example of multiple means. So I'm going to leave you with this final takeout, and repeating this can be quite empowering. Thank you for watching, and special thanks to many friends who helped me along the way.